1 2 1 2, and through the vocal blade went snicker snack. He left it dead, and with its head he went galumphing back. And hast thou slain the Jabberwock? Come to my arms, my beamish boy. O frabjous day, Callooh Callay, he chortled in his joy. What the fuck does that mean? Well, if you're asking that question, then you've already failed, since these verses are from Lewis Carroll's Jabberwocky, a poem intended to be entirely nonsensical. It doesn't intend to mean anything. Its value is derived from the humorous and playful nature of its fabricated words and phrases. Or is it? Slavoj Žižek wrote this in his sublime object of ideology. The time structure with which we are concerned here is such that it is mediated through subjectivity. A subjective mistake, fault, error, misrecognition arrives paradoxically before the truth in relation to which we are designating it as error, because this truth itself becomes true only through, or to use a Hegelian term, by mediation of, the error. Jabberwocky is by no means an obscure poem, at least in terms of its popularity. In fact, two of the made-up words in the verses I've read have entered the English vocabulary as defined words. Galumphing means galloping in a triumphant manner. Chortle means a snorting chuckle. If hypothetically every nonsense word used in this poem was later given a definition, then in what sense would it be nonsensical? Is the author's intended nonsense the misrecognition that arrives before the truth of its understood meaning? The perhaps difficult to accept reality is that intention matters extremely little in almost all aspects of language, but it is this apparent flaw that makes literature so impactful. It is the fact that literature is infinitely interpretable that makes it infinitely personal and limitlessly affecting. The meaning that literature has to us is almost certainly not the same meaning that was intended, because it is coloured by our own ideas and experiences. As Roland Barthes argued, to give a text an author is to impose a limit on that text. A slightly different attempt at creating nonsense was offered by Noam Chomsky in his The Logical Structure of Linguistic Theory. The sentence, "Colourless green ideas sleep furiously." This sentence is syntactically and grammatically correct, and there are no nonsensical words, but its internal contradictions seem to render it nonsensical. But again, despite nonsensicality seeming so inherent in the sentence, its meaning can be easily understood if the figurative meanings of these words are considered. The sentence can read, naive ideas which have not yet been realized can cause a mind to race whilst they still remain dormant. If colourless is understood as meaning nondescript, green as immature, sleep as dormant, and furiously as quickly or energetically. In fact, in 1985, Stanford University held a competition in which contestants were to use no more than 100 words of prose or 14 lines of verse in order to make Chomsky's sentence meaningful. Literature itself, then, seems to be the biggest obstacle to the existence of nonsense because of its emphasis upon the figurative interpretation of language. Before I introduce you to a writer that used this in order to create deeply meaningful poetry out of nonsensical language, I would like to offer you an opening line from an imaginary poem and ask you what you would guess the poem would be about. The line is, "Where the shadows form." So feel free to pause the video and try and create your own interpretation of this line. Now, how I would go about this would be to go through the connotations of the word used, so that I can use those connotations to come up with a potential meaning. For example, the phrase suggests 4 objects that we need to consider the connotations of: the shadows, the surface upon which the shadows appear, the objects that cast the shadows, and the light source shining upon those objects. Light functions as a means of revelation and exposition, which suggests that whatever is casting the shadows is being exposed or revealed in some way for something, and this implies that the poem is about to concern itself with a place in which the consequences of these expositions and revelations are looming. As a result of these considerations, we could come up with various interpretations to fit this abstracted image. example, the poem could be about a world in which the exposition of the corruption of authority figures causes social unrest and a decline in deference. The light could represent the media, the objects that cast shadows, authority figures, the shadows themselves, the people who subsequently disrespect the establishment, the surface, the place the poem is concerned with. Again, this is one of many interpretations that fits these ideas, but these ideas themselves are, too, one of many. Light isn't just a means of exposition, it is also a symbol of enlightenment and holiness. What is the significance of the shadows forming? What is the significance of the color contrast between the black shadows and the implied light? These questions have many answers, and whichever one you start with will likely lead to a different interpretation. But the process of understanding is the most important factor here, which is not one of literal reading, which makes colorless green ideas sleep furiously nonsensical. It is one of figurative interpretation. Hart Crane wrote in his essay General Aims and Theories, where he outlines his poetic method, that the terms of expression employed are often selected less for their logical, literal significance than for their associational meanings. What Crane considers important, then, is not the incoherence or coherence of sleeping furiously, but the interpretation of sleeping as remaining dormant, and furiously as meaning quickly or energetically. And this priority is clearly evident in his poetry. For example, in At Melville's Tomb, Crane writes, "Frosted eyes there were that lifted altars." In a 1926 letter to Harriet Monroe, Crane defends his use of nonsensical language for figurative meaning, and explains that this line refers to how a man naturally postulates a deity somehow, and the altar of that deity by the very action of the eyes lifted in searching. Quote, "It is then the nonsense of eyes lifting altars that gives this line its very meaning." So what conclusion can we come to? What is nonsense if both Jabberwocky and Colourless Green Ideas Sleep Furiously were written to be nonsensical, but are able to be interpreted meaningfully? What is nonsense if figurative meaning is always discoverable in apparently nonsensical phrases as well as sensical ones? The only sense in which unintelligibility can be said to exist is an objective one. A. J. Ayer argued that language that cannot be scientifically or analytically verified is meaningless, which seems a logical proposition given what has just been discussed. If almost all language is infinitely interpretable, and it's difficult to argue that mathematical or analytical statements are, then language does not contain a meaning that can be communicated out of context and immediately understood. But perhaps this is the problem. It isn't just nonsense that we need to redefine, it's also meaning. It's clear that meaning, despite its profound preciousness, is not something that exists independently of human perception or discovery. Language merely has practical significance.